I'm extremely excited to announce a brand new sponsor for the Behind the Shield podcast, and that is Rescue One CBD. For any of you who have listened to this podcast for the last 8 years, you would have heard my own personal journey from using prescription pills after a knee surgery to finding CBD and having incredible success with that. Now, I'm sure everyone listening is fully aware that we have an epidemic when it comes to the use of nicotine pouches, dip, and other products. Now, to combat this, John from Rescue One has developed a nicotine-free pouch called the RIP pouch. It's the first and only pouch that contains CBG, nootropics, and B vitamins for both energy and mental clarity. And as with all of their products, is tested to ensure it is 0.000% THC free. So completely trusted for anyone in uniform. And they always send a drug test with their products just to give you guys peace of mind. Now, the pre-sale for this incredible product has just begun and goes on till October 1st. So if you go to rescue1cbd.com, you can register for the pre-sale and make sure it ships the moment it is available. Now, on top of all that, Rescue One is offering you, the listener of the Behind the Shield podcast, 15% off your order if you use the code BTS, as in Behind the Shield. And you can find all of their products, you can find all of the testing and understand why this truly is a product that you can trust by going to rescue1cbd.com. And you can listen to my conversation with John on episode 1011 of the Behind the Shield podcast. This episode is sponsored by Bubs Naturals, yet another company that I tracked down to bring on as a sponsor because I myself love their products. They are offering you, the audience of the Behind the Shield podcast, a 20% discount. But before we get to that, I do want to highlight a few of the products that I use myself. Firstly, collagen. I am about to turn 50, and so my hair, my skin, my nails, not really a big concern when I was younger, definitely a lot more of a concern now. However, where I've really seen the impact is joint health and gut health. And have been blown away that when I'm consistent using collagen, Bubs collagen in this case, I see a massive improvement in both. Another area, I drink coffee, love coffee, and in the morning I use the Halo Creamer. Now originally I used the MCT oil powder, but now they have the Halo Creamer, which has also got grass-fed butter in it. A lot more creamy if you're not trying to go for the vegan option that they have as well. Now it's important to mention as well the altruistic element of Bubs Naturals. The origin story involves Glenn Bub Doherty, one of the 2 Navy SEALs killed in Benghazi, and a good friend of the founders, Sean and TJ. So 10% of every single sale goes towards the Glenn Doherty Foundation. Now, as I mentioned before, they are offering you, the audience, 20% off your purchase if you use the code SHIELD. That's SHIELD at bubsnaturals.com. And finally, if you want to hear more about their products and Glenn's powerful story, listen to episode 558 with co-founder Sean Lake. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show sports scientist and clinical sports psychologist, Dr. John Sullivan. So in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his work with some of the most elite sports and tactical athletes on the planet, forging performance, the importance of sleep, loss of identity, the perils of social media, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of well over 1,100 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I welcome to the show Dr. John Sullivan. Enjoy. Well, John, I want to start by saying two things. Firstly, thank you to our mutual friend, Jeff Nichols, for making this connection, another phenomenal human being. And secondly, I want to welcome you onto the Behind the Shield podcast today.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invite, and I appreciate we know that great human in kind. Fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, first question, where on planet Earth are we finding you today?
You're finding me in Auckland, New Zealand, and actually to be more specific, Torbay, right near the water. So the other side of the world, as we would say, down under.
Absolutely. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, where is Torbay? Because that sounds familiar. I did a whole like North Island all the way through to South Island trip,
Fantastic.
like 2020. So it's not 2020, 2000. So where's Torbay?
So it's about a 40-minute drive heading north, and then you would end up on the coast. So 40-minute drive from city center Auckland. And so Auckland has a number of suburbs that surround it. And so really where I'm at is quite a large sailing community, because there's quite a number of yacht clubs, and Auckland's known as the city of sails. So once you're around Auckland or near the bays where I'm at, that's alive and well. You're going to see boats galore.
Absolutely. I've said that I love the culture there in New Zealand. When I went there in the year 2000, it was so clean. Everyone was so friendly. And I traveled around the world. I'd been to Fiji by that point and learned about, some of the colonization from the UK and how the dynamic was different. Like in Fiji, laws are put in that they can't sell Fijian land to protect the farmers from, more astute business people coming in. But in New Zealand, I remember it being a lot more kind of equal. And I can just see these British, sailors arriving on the shores and the Maori showing up and then being like, hello, would you like to be friends? Because they look at them going, they're not going to beat them. There's no way in hell.
I would agree with you. I think one of the things I've been impressed being here for 3 years is that equality, or working towards equal. Right. We know with colonization, it wasn't perfect, and we don't have to stay anchored there. We can keep moving it forward. And I've been impressed by, a nation that can admit to its first sins can get clear on a lot of those sins going forward. So it's an impressive place that way. I would agree with you. There is no doubt. There's a merging of the cultures, almost like I've seen in another space I call home, Ireland, where you'll see, the peace and the wanting to keep that in Northern Ireland, but also the sharing of language and bringing language back. So you'll see Gaelic and English. Well, here you'll see a lot more English and Maori. And so it's a wonderful blend. Absolutely.
I was just having a conversation with someone the other day about that very thing, like being British, firstly, understanding that only a small group of people benefited from all these things, slavery, colonization, etc. If you look at British history, we were poor most of the time, the average person. Secondly, when you had the humility to look back and go, yeah, some of the things that we did were horrible, and let's not hang on to it and be victims about it either, but you have to acknowledge it. You have to understand that it had an impact, even in, the Middle East. I mean, all these different conflicts that we're seeing, that, like you said, is when then you can finally move forward. But if you're beating your chest and, saying you're the greatest nation and ignoring the bad things in your culture, you're never, ever going to progress.
Yeah, there's a gap there. You're absolutely right. It isn't healthy also to be victimized by your history. I mean, we live life going forward, but we learn life by looking back. But to go forward would mean you have to acknowledge things. You have to find connection points. You have to find understanding. And we can't be necessarily making the past correct, but we can make things better in the forward position. And I agree with you 100%. I think that's one of the things I really enjoy about being in New Zealand when I look at it, is that there are opportunities. And although we're at the end of the world, there's a lot of learnings if we just look over our fence line, no matter where we live. So I'm a U.S. citizen, a Canadian citizen, an Irish citizen. And I've always encouraged people to kind of look over your fence line. No one can be doing everything right. No one can have all the best ideas. But if we look over the fence and learn from others, there's greater opportunities than just doing kind of this. And we keep our focal point just on me and a little bit of the we. We can learn a lot from others.
Absolutely. I think we said this when we spoke last time, but as I've progressed through this, I've learned and spoken to people that have spearheaded, prison, the amazing prison systems they have in Norway, and the decriminalization of drugs in Portugal, and the Finnish education system. And when you have the
Yeah.
humility to say, "Hey, you're doing this really well. Can you show us what to do?" It's that, the rising tide lifts all ships, and we all benefit from it.
Yeah. That quote it serves all of us when we first to understand it. I think the piece you're talking about here too is anchored in something that often people think is the past, which is philosophy. And what you're talking about is intellectual humility. That we all need to feel comfortable we know what we know, but also feel comfortable with what we don't know, and pursue those gaps or seek out the meaning of those gaps, whether we want to become an expert or just seek an expert opinion to form our understanding. Because if we're just kind of going with our own thoughts, we're really susceptible as human beings to confirmation bias, believing what we want to believe. And then we're really good at doubling down on that when we're confronted with different information. And that's called, belief perseverance. And so we got to have intellectual humility. It's such a grounding point. Philosophy has much to teach science and humanity. It is not a thing of the past, having trained in epistemology. It really does inform how we see the world, and in a disciplined way.
It's funny. I've never heard that term, belief perseverance, but that's exactly what I've endured whilst trying to be one voice of changing the work week in the fire service. And we're going to take a deep dive into all things performance and sleep in a little bit, but getting them to realize that the 56-hour work week that they've been working is one of the biggest reasons why we've seen our profession collapse. Losing people, losing marriages, losing children, not to mention, the inability to save when we're supposed to be performing. But we're so indoctrinated in this kind of, almost like this hero mentality that we can do more with less over and over and over again, that even when we finally had enough information to say, hey, this is the problem and here's one of the most powerful solutions, I've had so much resistance. And it's changed now. Florida, we're having this revolution. I'm so happy to say that. But I literally would have people that would fight me say, no, I want to hang on to my 56-hour work week. I don't want to do that 42-hour work week. Men and women that are not going home to their children because of this broken system. So that term specifically really, resonates deeply with me.
Mm. It does with me now as well for a whole host of reasons. That whole idea from a psychological standpoint has been around for a while, but I think its meaning is even bigger now because of the decay of our information ecosystems. I'm old enough to remember, I won't put you in that same space, but where news was really not an hour. There was very little commentary. It was just the facts. And the facts were agreed upon, which created a stability in society. Now, the best case scenario due to our information ecosystem is misinformation. That's the best case scenario. But the majority of information that we digest is disinformation, purposely put out there to confuse the public or to provide some sort of traction for some sort of other agenda. And that's a very revolutionary space that we're in. And I mean that in a negative halo, that other people are benefiting from that confusion in the space. And so belief perseverance is as much as common as to what channels do you listen to and what is the bias and bent. So it's concerning. Absolutely. So it's tough to get truth out there, even though truth is a stubborn thing. Facts are stubborn things. When you have this bulwark against hearing truth, it's difficult, especially when meaningful things like firefighters' health. Oh, that should be easy to discuss.
Yeah. Or children in Gaza, but we'll leave
Yeah.
that there.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, then moving on, because we could take a massive deep dive into the Orwellian issues that are going on at the moment, but I don't want to deviate from all the other stuff. Maybe we can do a part two and we'll dive into the idiocracy another time. So let's start at the very beginning. You mentioned all the three nationalities. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Yep. Yeah, sure. Happy to. So I was born in Rochester, New York, so right across Lake Ontario from Toronto. So my father, life of service, but also in some unique wrinkles in there. So he served in the Navy, and served on board a frigate. He was damage control third class, so in some ways he had already gone into the Navy and having firefighter skills. He was also a firefighter when he came out. But then also he was a volunteer firefighter, so he worked full time for Eastman Kodak. But I always saw that thread of service and spoke about it. Served in the flotilla for the USS Nautilus, first nuclear sub, and spoke about his time in the Navy very, very highly. And I think there's a part of him that would have liked to stay in longer. But yet I also saw being a firefighter as a bridge to continuing that journey for him. My mom was a nurse, so also spent her whole life in service. She worked in the VA system, so was very close to those who served, and spoke very highly about that too in many different ways. They were not afraid of sharing the stories and the values of service to others and service to others who served. And so that was a really wonderful period of time to learn through seeing and hearing the stories, as we all do. We learn through stories. I have two older siblings. My oldest brother is actually developmentally delayed. So that too was an amazing journey for me to see life, situation, context through a different lens and see how the environment and people and the community responded to that and how my parents managed that. My middle brother, amazing. I don't know where I would be in my life without him, because at a very young age, he had to step up to be, the brother, the sibling who would take much of the support, much of the organization, much of the position of helping my parents out run a household, because with three sons, there's a special place in the afterlife for parents who have three sons. I'm convinced of that. I have a staff member right now that has three young sons, and I just watch her from a distance go, oh yeah, I remember that. And then during that time, my dad worked for Eastman Kodak, which was a multinational company. And there was a period of time where they needed some skill in Toronto, where the headquarters of Eastman Kodak is for Canada, or was for Canada. And so we spent some time there. What was interesting was my mom's family came from Italy and settled in Canada. So almost all my entire family on my maternal side is all Canadian, which I truly love. I have such special moments of spending time all over Canada. And the warmth, I know that's unfortunately changed due to the political environment, but amazing people, amazing country. And then I've had time in my life to be able to spend time in Ireland as well, in the Dublin area. And so were my grandparents, my father's side, all from Ireland directly. And in fact, my family kind of dates back to the founding of the U.S. So General John Sullivan, a brigadier general, was the right hand of George Washington, and that's directly connected to my family. So in my family, we've probably every generation has served either in the United States or Canada on both sides, the Irish and Italian family. Yeah.
Amazing. When you reflect back now, you had a father in the military and then the fire service, and mother in nursing, knowing these are not only noble professions, but they also sometimes come at a cost. With this lens that you have now, when you reflect back, were there any impacts of those professions on your parents?
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing. They didn't tell these stories. Obviously they were age appropriate, but they were unvarnished. They were not going to spare truth. There are a number of amazing gifts I got from my parents, but curiosity was one of those, but also truth and wanting to understand facts of things. And so absolutely. One of the things you put out there earlier about the amazing things that are happening in Florida to take care of firefighters, the shift work that my father did as a volunteer firefighter, being on call, that I certainly saw. We certainly saw that. And you see it through somewhat of a child's eyes too. He could speak to it, but his whole presence changed. And now knowing the science of that, why does his whole presence change? How did he move? How does his face shaped, verbalizations, tone, pitch, that sense of exhaustion? Absolutely. And then certainly my mom, as a nurse, worked through many different rotations in a hospital. She had many loves of where to work and how to serve. And you could see that in her shift work as well, but they would speak to it in that to care for others, you had to care for yourself. Otherwise, your ability to really be good at what you do and care for others diminishes quickly. We have a name for it now, and in some reference is, that sense of showing compassion can become fatigued. But we also know other things become fatigued. How well do you move? How well do you decide? How well do you execute? But they didn't spare us on that. They would talk about it, right? And being a volunteer firefighter, as you imagine, is slightly different, where you can have a little bit more autonomy among the community to decide how you want to function and think about families first. And I remember my dad being a fire commissioner and fighting for those things, but also listening to his people. But how do we make this better? So no, that was discussed. It was not this beautiful fantasy, which draws us to things, right? That curiosity. It's okay. People grow up, they want to be police officers, firefighters, these noble professions, but there does be a time where you got to drill down on the truth. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. What about the VA through your mum's eyes? Because as we hear now, especially with the mental health side, there's over and over and over again, US veterans have been on here, and I went in there and they just threw a bunch of meds at me and that was it. But obviously there's other areas that are phenomenal. My wife just worked in the optometry side as she came out of her doctor's school. And was blown away how amazing it was there. So what was her kind of perception of the decay or anything as far as that system? Because at its core, the purpose is a beautiful purpose, but the way it's managed and the way it's funded maybe needs some help.
Yeah, and I like what you said there. There is generational shifts on that because you have to learn from and constantly, especially in a hospital, you should be learning every day about how you're serving those people who are coming in for services. And I think over time, what ends up happening is they're caught into this, and certainly heard about it, this political crunch of something we all know and something we honestly I've been a part of in sport to transform a little bit. Healthcare costs. There is no doubt it is expensive to take care of human beings. We shouldn't deny that point. We should just find points of how can we be more effective and then more efficient. But that doesn't mean staffing ratios are lower. And that's often the place where people go. But when it's a human to human interaction of caring, that is the worst place to go. And you're right. Meds can't be a solution to a human. They're a tool to a human to human connection point. You need the expertise. And so what she saw in her journey was certainly this generational shifts and these political shifts. And so as policies change, so did the hospital have to change in what became best practice and keep that best practice solid. Because when you're taking revenue away or taking staffing ratios, then you have to get on your front foot. How do we meet the need? But then how do we create a narrative where policyholders can understand and leaders can understand that this strategy will not meet the mission of taking care of people? And so there was always this piece, and I think nurses are very good at this. There's more nurses than doctors in a hospital, of advocating and really elevating that truth. So she was I would hear about that, right? When we would change government, they would start to mobilize before that of how they'd have to narrative differently, how they'd have to do things differently. And so there was this adaptation that had to happen. We got to adapt. This is going to happen. The people aren't going to stop coming through the door. And certainly I would see some of that sadness about that too, but also the fervor to advocate, right? Nurses are great at that. And they also have more contact with people. So they see it happening faster. Yeah.
Why is there a resistance to proactive solutions? Like, for example, one of the reasons why we've managed to get this foothold in Florida is people finally went to the organizations and said, how much is the way that we're doing it now costing us in overtime, in training young firefighters who then leave 2-3 years later, workman's comp claims, lawsuits, medical disability, retirements, and it was millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And it blows me away that the finance people aren't the ones banging on the door saying, hey, you need to change. We need to give you a better work week. It's a false economy, but we're not hearing that. And the same as the NHS. Amazing system, but it got picked apart. The Brits got sicker and fatter, and now it's destroying the system. So what is the resistance when you understand basic economics as far as a proactive investment to simply investing on the front end to save a lot of money on the back end?
Yeah, and again, these are great points, and you're giving great examples from systems that are quite amazing. The NHS is an amazing system. It is also something that many countries look to follow and understand. And yet, you're right, it's been picked apart. I think when you look at healthcare, it is complex and it is regional or postal code or zip code. You have to understand the context. Context is king. There are component parts to it. We don't need to understand all of it, but we need to understand the parts that move it. I'll speak to one that we've kind of both touched on a little bit in this conversation, which is one of the harder pieces, because we do live by narrative and we do need to construct well-packaged truth with fact-based understanding to get people to move. We have to think about it like a campaign. Sometimes science misses that, actually. They think facts will move people enough. And facts do move people, but it is not enough. It's not fully sufficient. We have to think about how do we campaign with a narrative that moves people. But I think in some situations, certainly not all, I don't want to broad brushstroke this, but Upton Sinclair said it best. You can't convince people of the truth if they're paid not to hear it. And so we've created situations in which people are paid not to move the system. And that's a shameful reflection about we've missed the mission, that if we are human beings, ultimately, we have compassion. And most people, if you sit with them and hear their story, you will come to understand, you'll have compassion, empathy, but you also have inspiration. But you literally put people's survival, the money, because money really is about comfort and survival. If you pay them not to hear the compassion, the truth, the stories, then you have a hell of a bulwark to work around. And that creates very difficult pieces. And it makes us have to question, what are we doing with our human-based systems if we're setting up situations such as that? I think the other pieces also have to do with, I'll give an example for where I am locally. Being at the end of the world, we have some similar things to concerns of the middle of the country in Canada and the U.S. We're very much bi-coastal countries, both Canada and the U.S. Most people live on the coast, East and West Coast. And so there's not enough providers pick the expertise in the middle of those countries. Where New Zealand is similar. Their mission is to care, and their want to do that is only hampered by the number of allied health professionals they have in country. And so we have to think people first, and then, strategy and structure second and third. And often what we do is we pretend that we can simplify complex problems down to it's just efficiencies. Now, efficiencies do matter. We can find inefficiencies in any system. We could take a system that's very linear, like our motor. Like, we have people that are wrenching on their cars right now somewhere around the world, getting more power, more efficiency out of that engine. We can, but it is not built on resiliency. So you can only get efficient to a point. If you don't have people and processes that can meet the need, eventually the system collapses. And so we forget people, and people's resiliency and expertise is a key factor in this. And then having people who are willing to solve problems is a factor in this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that perspective. Let's go back to your early life. You ended up working with a lot of athletes from all different sports. What were you playing and doing when you were in the school ages?
You're going to make me go back that far.
Yes.
James, that's a dot on the horizon for me these days. But so I was lucky. I grew up obviously having two brothers ahead of me who were actually very, very sporty, very, very active. And we know from the research, like if you have older siblings, that actually, relatively speaking, it's not a 100% rule. Let's be honest. This is more corollary than cause and effect. But you tend to be attracted to a lot of different sports, and then you tend to be a little bit better of an athlete. So that's a gift they gave me, and they both were very good athletes. And I grew up playing. My first love was football with an Irish and Italian grandparents. There was a ball at our feet when we were quite young. And I just fell in love with that sport. But I did do traditional American sports as well. So played softball, played baseball, played football, not organized, but if there was the touch football game or tackle football game, which I wouldn't encourage now, but we were playing it. And then over time, gravitated to athletics, distance running, and cycling. And so those are the sports that I competed in at an NCAA Division I level, and then later on competed at an international level. So, but still, I would say football is my first love. Love that sport. It was a great foundation for the things I found myself in at my next chapters in my life.
Did you play as an adult?
I did. I don't play as much anymore. I'd like to get back into it. It was moving country, but I used to play. I lived part-time in Newport, Rhode Island. So there was a Saturday game. And then if I was in Washington, D.C., where I lived part-time, eventually there full-time, I would go play out at the Washington Monument. There's at least 30 games going on, on any given Sunday. So that was great fun. Great fun.
This is always interesting, and you've again worked with so many, elite athletes and coaches now. When I moved to the US, it wasn't long after that I started realizing that I kept hearing what I call Uncle Rico stories. So deconditioned 30-year-olds telling me how they coulda, woulda, shoulda been the next, Gretzky or whoever it was. And this is not me being condescending at all. I was like, what is going on here? Because in the time that I grew up in England, there wasn't a high level of athleticism at the, school or really college level. There wasn't. But what happened was people kept playing. You had pub leagues, you had local leagues, and adults continued to play sports. What I saw more and more here is you had a high level of athleticism in school and college, and then a physical or mental burnout that left a complete void when it came to activity with people that had transitioned out of education, which was a cultural thing. So I realized that there was maybe an abused line between performance, winning your college or school a championship, and the well-being and longevity of the young athlete.
James, what a great observation. And it's one of those things that when you come in as an outsider and you zoom in and zoom out, you can see things that parts of the culture may not acknowledge but are spot on. So just to speak about the research, that really your observation and anecdote does fit with our research when we look at North American sport. So yes, on an Olympic level, if we use that as some sort of benchmark, we do win a lot of medals. But we do that out of sheer population and diversity. And yes, the maturity of our systems. But if we really want to scratch the surface, your observation and the research would say we break more athletes than we actually develop. And it is in this system of more is better. And the problem with that is the other observation you made, which is very keen. So when you break someone who really know, very few are going to make it to the pinnacle. Very few are going to get to that elite status. It's just, there isn't enough space, regardless if you have tons of talent. And when you break an athlete, where do they end up? They ended up in our obesity research. So is there a health burden on that when we don't take care of athletes and we don't treat them or teach them that this is something for a lifetime of opportunity for health? And when we're not being honest about how do you train someone with proper doses, and that not everyone is going to make it, but you are learning transitional and transferable skills. Yeah, so keen observation. And what's sad on the other side of that is we break so many that they end up in a burden to themselves, and not in a great resilient place.
Now, I'm sure this is going to mirror many things that you've seen at the high level, the professional level, but another area that I think is very worrying. And I just watched that film Varsity Blues the other day. I thought it was a teen film. My wife watched it, and I was blubbering and was amazed that a 1999 film was hitting all the things that we're talking about today, like CTE and all the other areas, but was also that loss of identity. Now, we understand it in the military. We understand it. I think we're starting to now in the first responder profession. But you've got a kid that ever since they were peewee were playing football, and all up until that point of they just aren't good enough anymore, or they have that, career-ending injury. From the mental health side, I can see how detrimental that would be to a child.
You're 100% right. That research really we're looking at kind of anyone who funnels their identity into kind of one, let's say, pinpoint thing, or just anchors there so strongly that obviously the ebbs and flows of winning, losing, not getting playing time, not feeling like you're developing fast enough, those create vulnerabilities if that's all you see yourself as an athlete. We would call it identity foreclosure, right? Or someone's foreclosing, not looking at other opportunities, not exploring other spaces. So we've known for quite a while, if you want to make a healthy athlete, is actually to look at their life holistically. It's not just about sport. It's sport and life. It's other opportunities. But across many times where athletes who invested in other areas, whether it be going for a degree, working part-time as they train at the elite level, investing more time as a parent, or investing more time with friends and family, that buoys them. It creates more resiliency, and you have more stress buffering. And we've known this so much that when I was I was in my first master's program, one of my professors was doing really seminal work with USOC on this very issue. Like, listen, if we don't get to them early to expand their horizons and show them also that they're not just playing a sport, they're learning skills that they can transfer, we're creating vulnerabilities. And this was in the early 90s. And it's taken us to this time for elite sport, and I would say probably early 2000s to go, we need to invest in this space. And that's some of the work I did when I started with the New England Patriots was, listen, if we don't prepare them for life, because the average is a 2-year, they're only in the league 2 years. That's the average. So you have a window of opportunity that closes quickly. So if we don't prepare them equally to play and to have a quality of life, then what we're doing in some ways is not taking care of them, quite simply. And especially if we know the data. The tragedy would be ignore the data. And the data would say 2 years. So we put a program together that allowed them to learn how to be a professional football player, but also prepared them. And we had very high percentage rates of graduation or starting master's degrees and internships in the off season, to again expand horizons. We had family days, so the family knew what they were going through, because it is somewhat, for 16 weeks, now 18, like being in the military. And so if we didn't include family and we didn't support family, that seems like this thing that is becoming a wedge between the family members. And so I think there is a seed change. But to your point of the movie you're watching, do we see that seed change in the lower high school, which is very professionalized in North America? It depends upon zip code, which is very unfortunate, just like healthcare. Depends upon the zip code. And so there are programs that attend to that, and there are some really evidence-based programs to give, those interventions to high school athletes. But we need to do a better job. If we're breaking more athletes than developing, right there, the tragedy is not listening to that data.
It's funny because it mirrors the conversation again with military, but especially first responders. And military, I think for all of us, it's understanding that the branch that you were in, the special operations group, the fire department, is actually not, who you are. You are a
Yeah.
good human being that wanted to make the world a little bit better. The mission hasn't changed when you took the uniform off, but it's very hard because we cling on to it. But when you now shift to this healthier work week, and you have, one of the pushbacks is like, well, the overtime's going to go away, or even worse, I'll nauseatingly get chiefs and other people say, well, if we give them more time off, they're just going to work more, which, you know, you don't govern someone's days off. That's a nauseating thing to say, but also, well, that's the point. If you fully staff a fire department, the overtime goes away, so that ability disappears anyway. But now you've freed up more time, because there's nothing wrong with someone being a personal trainer or a carpenter or, a landscaper on their days off, because they're still going to have dinner with their family. They're still going to go to bed. So that, I think the other side of this is, well, now you are an entrepreneur on your days off, that you're not a firefighter. So God forbid you get hurt, you get fired, you just simply retire. You've already got that other tribe, that other identity, versus everything being all in on that one profession.
100%. When you're trying to balance everything on a pinpoint, we can kind of understand what's going to happen. And when you give people time, there needs to be some guidance, like you're saying, maybe giving some education about that, but not guidance in the way that you can't, because human variation should teach us that, that's the rule, not the exception. So there are many paths to balance and health, and coming back to the fire department, using that example, because you were doing these other things, because you're investing elsewhere, you're more present, more available, and more capable. We have to, give some education. And what you're talking about too is every individual in their career goes through transitions. In psychology, we refer to, your first 10 years, you're an early career professional. You have a doctorate, you're licensed, you're registered, and then a mid-career professional. We talk about those transitions in there and possibilities or potentials to how to reinvest in yourself. Some of that's not anchoring in psychology. It's the very thing you're saying, investing outside of that. And then late career professionals, keeping in mind that you're staying sharp with your information, your technical knowledge, but also that you may need more rest to do what you did prior. And if we think about our professions as transitions, just like with athletes, like that same, Tom Brady, when he was later in his career, it's not the same Tom Brady that walked into the league. He can't be. And you have to change your process to attend to those needs. And I think if we think about things as much more as nonlinear than linear, that things go up and down, and there's a value base to that, we can understand how to intervene with more precision.
While we're on the subject of youth athletes, because this is again a very adult problem as well, but I think it starts, in our schools. Talk to me about CTE. You made the comment about, not wanting, your kids to play football now. But, obviously there is some middle ground. I'm a martial artist, so I got knocked around for most of my teen and then young adult years.
Yep.
What is the evolution of the understanding between the old, just shake it off again, Varsity Blues did a great job highlighting that, to where we are today, where even, mixed martial artists are sparring a lot less than they used to?
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for bringing that sport into it, because certainly it's near and dear to me. It was one of the sports that certainly I was involved in, with the kaleidoscope of things that I enjoyed doing in sport, but also that you're talking about brain health, and we're all at a disadvantage, quite frankly. If I didn't study psychology and neuropsychology and neuroscience, I don't think I'd know very much. Just going back to where you were anchoring, what do we learn in our schools, in our formal learning about brain health? And typically we learn much more about other factors of health, but there is none more important than brain health. The brain is the driver of health. And if we understand that, we can facilitate much more. And with kind of brain health issues, concussion is one of those pieces. And by no means, and I think you're giving me a job to speak to it, I'm not saying we shouldn't do sport. There are calculated risks. I'm not a big believer in we should just stop doing these sort of things. I think as we learn, to your question, more knowledge, we understand how to do it with more precision and more refinement to protect the person. Like, for instance, if we look at some collision sports, there are drills in football AFL football, rugby, ice hockey, those collision sports that we don't do anymore because we know they don't prepare the athlete, but also it puts them in a vulnerability to actually have brain health. So we're learning. One of the things I would say is, and I don't typically say this, but I will with you, to be quite honest. We don't know what CT is. Let's be honest. If you say that in certain environments, they'll think you're a heretic. What I mean by that is we know something's going on. There's a syndrome there, but it's likely 10 to 12 different types of things that are causing brain health issues. And so we're at the verge of unpackaging that. Something's going on. It's real. I'm going to be clear. People should hear me say that. It's real. At the same time, what we need to get is more precise about what it is on each individual level so we can target treatment more precisely to get them back to health. The state of play is this. We can't pretend anymore. Right? If when in doubt, people need to sit out. And that's the piece. Majority of people recover from concussion with treatment. And there is some that don't get treatment who do recover. But if we do the right things to draw down on the demand of energy from the brain and allow people to have rest cycles for healing, that's how tissue grows. So a training day is stimulation for growth at every cellular level, brain to the other 11 systems out. And if you give someone rest, they will readapt and grow those tissues back and have some resiliency. So that's why treatment is so important. But treatment's important for another reason. Having worked for concussion for a great majority of my career, I have had many athletes, and also we have to understand the work you've done and household injuries and motor accidents or car accidents are the most common. It's really not in sport. Although we focus because it's a microcosm of culture and everyone loves sport, it happens outside of sport much more. And sitting with patients, they learn how their brain works and they learn how to recover on a more sufficient level when they leave that, when they go through therapy, in treatment or rehabilitation. And so what it is a learning journey. How does my brain work? How do I make it more resilient from these days going forward? But really the state of play is we're getting much sharper at being able to protect it, assess it, and rehabilitate it. When I first started in collision sports, it was really the dark ages. I mean, let's take motorsports, for instance. I mean, when you think about the really G-forces and the number of micro traumas an F1 driver, Indy driver, NASCAR driver is experiencing, or rally car, it's quite significant. But in the past, and I'm not holding people to it as we know more now, but just to give that example from your question, is they would assess the driver and just put him back in the car. Like, what? I mean, we encourage people who have concussions to have someone drive them to the clinic now. So I think when you look at the span, there's more we can do, but we've gotten a lot more precise of starting to understand. It's actually it understanding the individual, because everything isn't, an individual care situation. Understanding that gives us more understanding of how we can rehabilitate them faster.
I was with Shootbox years ago in LA. They opened a gym for a short time. And, they say you should never talk about Fight Club, but that's basically what it was. And I learned one thing, that I'm not a giant pussy. That was it, because it was nothing but just getting the shit beaten out of me by people that were much better fighters. But, the licks that I took for a short time, and now you like a full, shootbox fighter that's, got years and years in a career, you see just how detrimental that could be. And there was that one video of Nam Fan that went around, showing pre and post, and just, it was, devastating to see it. So sticking with that sport, with the combat striking sports, what advice would you give to people listening as far as, where those gyms should be now? Obviously, when you're actually in the ring, if you're a competitive fighter, you're going to have to do some sparring where you're ramping up a little bit, but yes. What is that secret sauce as far as taking away hard sparring or other areas so we can kind of reduce the amount of head trauma they get prior to a competition?
It's a fantastic question, and you kind of hinted to it, and I can speak to some of this about how this does help with preparation. So you spoke about a lot of MMA athletes now not doing as much hard sparring. They're doing much more what we would call, cognitive training and looking for patterns and doing much more tag. There's a colleague of mine who started the Australian Institute of Sport, Alan Hahn, who actually developed gloves that much more have to do with tag. So you're looking for openings. It's much more cognitive, emotional training. You're predicting movement, and the brain doesn't react, it predicts. And so that has more benefit because that's what you're really doing. The hits are going to come, but more of trying to find the openings and understand the pattern faster. So what that allows for is what we're talking about here is, yes, you're doing training, but you're amply doing much more rest cycles. So you consolidate your learning on a physical, cognitive, and emotional level. And so what I would say is, yes, you have to do hard sparring, but you should be anchoring a little bit more on understanding how to read and react and time your movements. The hits will be there, but if you can be there faster and you can find the openings quicker, you are going to be the one that over time, especially in the rounds, because, right, your cardiovascular fitness helps your brain being able to read and react as well. They're all connected in a complex system. You're going to end up being in an advantage point. And so I like what I'm seeing now. They're seeing much more opportunity and much more health. Sport and the fight game and combat sports is filled with a lot of tradition. But I've come from environments where once tradition no longer meets science, it's no longer tradition. Because now what we're being is foolish. And so I love what you're anchoring on, and I like what a lot of those athletes are doing. They're using science to inform their practice and iterating it to their individual needs. That's a smart move.
It's funny what you just said about tradition, because this is the one thing with the American fire helmet. People hate it when I talk about this, but it's just the truth. I don't know if you can see it on my shoulder. There's literally the blueprint of the fire helmet from 1937. And they talk about, well, it's tradition. And I think, no, it's a hat. Tradition is teamwork, courage, selflessness, service, working under pressure. That's the tradition of the fire service. The other stuff is just clothes and protective equipment. And if you're refusing to advance because you care about how you look, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. The Navy SEALs don't wear tin helmets for a reason.
And I would say it's a wonderful point. I would say, and another example is, okay, do we see American football players wearing the leather helmets of days gone by? When they wore them, there were 8 deaths in the NCAA system. And that's when Teddy Roosevelt called a meeting at the White House, because they looked to cancel American football because of those numerous deaths of young men at many of the major universities that played at that time. Now, they thought they solved it, but regardless, they were like, listen, we got to look at this. And what you see now is an iteration of that helmet with science, of really trying to mitigate using laws of physics, forces moving away from the head as opposed to pinpoint focused. Now, granted, it's a tough thing when the brain is a millimeter of space from the inside of your skull, is to, it is going to hit, but with what forces? And so you're right. We have to iterate. And it's interesting you mentioned the Navy SEALs. I mean, that quote I gave is pretty much what is utilized at the command. Like, we have to evolve. Our opponents are evolving. The world is evolving. If you think you can stand still, like, you are already falling behind. And so I appreciate that. Your equipment's got to meet the need. Got to meet the need.
Absolutely. Well, one more area about head trauma before we progress into the psychological side of things. A few people I know who have suffered from ALS, there seems to be a common denominator with playing football when they were younger. So what about some of these neurodegenerative diseases, ALS, Parkinson's? What are we seeing as far as the correlation between head trauma and, these as they progress through adulthood?
I mean, the simple answer is this: and again, it plays on Bayesian logic, meaning for this not to be true, we have to forget everything we know. And so if I say to someone, go hit your head against a wall for a certain amount of time every day, can we expect there can be some negative impact using corollary, right? This is likely to happen to some percentage. Yeah, we've known this. I mean, this is not new. If we think about the degenerative disorders first being recorded in extreme jobs or hard work, or also in sport, we're looking at 1800s, I believe. And so this has been recorded in the annals of science, like something's happening here and it isn't good. It is, again, I go back to, do we want to hear this story? Do we want to have compassion about this? Or do we want to believe in myths and false narratives of individual ruggedness? Oh, if they were just stronger. And are we talking about these things to make change to people who are paid not to hear it? I mean, we have an example live in North American pro sports. So the NFL, it took them long enough, but they eventually admitted that there are hazards to the job. And really, that's all they've said. And that's not a big movement. Now, granted, yes, they've invested some money, although there's some conflicts with that. They've always left teams to do the league minimum and do whatever you want beyond that. When I was with New England, there was a league minimum, but we always went beyond that. I happened to work for a coach, Bill Belichick, who believed very strongly that this is real. This is something we should be concerned about. And this is something I need to think about that player at 40 and 50. And he did. So he allowed his medical staff to go much farther to protect the athletes. Eventually, the league also moved to having people on injured reserve who you could bring back, which was another wonderful thing and another wonderful adaptation. But all the league has said is there's hazards to the job. That's good, though, in some ways. It gives autonomy, choice, and informed consent to people. This is what I'm walking into. But the live example of the ignorance of being paid not to be clear about this stuff is the NHL. They still don't admit they're playing hockey with skate speeds at 34 to 45 miles per hour, puck speed up to over 100 miles per hour, and then crossing routes and walls that you're crashing into at those speeds. Doesn't affect brain health. So the common knowledge is we would have to forget all science of what we know for there not to be a corollary in degenerative diseases.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you said that, paid to not acknowledge. I mean, that's pretty much prevalent right now, for example. But all right, well, shifting to the psychology side, let's go all the way back. As you were progressing through the school ages, was that something you were already interested in, or was that something that came later?
It's a great question. Love that question. Origin questions are always wonderful. I think there was always a piece, and especially having an older brother who is developmentally delayed, there was a part of me, and this wasn't, I think there were multiple things that drove me into psychology and really my interest level and my curiosity, but that was one, trying to understand why was my brother as he was, and then even more importantly, seeing how people reacted to him. So one of my earliest memories. So my brother Tom, he was a very skilled athlete. He actually was quite coordinated. Loved to ride his bike. I swear to God, I don't know. We didn't have those on his bike. We didn't have any tools to measure how much he rode. I would say, but by a day, he was probably out there at least 3 to 4 hours every day. And so fitness level was just through the roof. And so when he did other things. But one of the observations I would make is around the neighborhood, there were certain people who would not let their kids play with my older brother. They would not let them even near him. So that level of knowledge about this isn't contagious. He's not harmful. And in fact, his temperament is amazing. His temperament is absolutely so friendly and gregarious. But there was one family, and the family was African American, and the majority of the neighborhood where I grew up was Caucasian, was white, European based. It changed over time, but I remember particularly this one family because at the time they probably were one of the very few minorities. And Tom loved playing basketball, and he was quite good at that as well. And he would ride, and then he'd stop in front of the house and watch him play basketball. And I watched their father invite him to play with his kids. And there was something there about the social dynamics of why people make choices, and the compassion and the concern and the empathy. And that has always stayed with me. Why we do the things we do, why we keep people out, why do we create closed environments. I also think I was driven to it by the curiosity that my parents instilled in me, and wanting to understand why and drilling down on that. And then the other thing that drew me to it was, so I was an athlete, and I just figured sweat wasn't enough. And it isn't. More isn't better. So how do you put a program together that touches on all the things, physical, emotional, and cognitive of the needs of any sport? And sports psychology, was quite young at that point, but I was reading stuff at my level. And then it was really mentorship at the university level with a great mentor and great professor who really kind of allowed me to see, yes, there's this subdiscipline of sports psychology and psychology, but there's also all of this. And to be good at that subdiscipline, you have to be good at all these other things. And so those were the things, I think, the major drivers. My brother, my parents instilling curiosity, my curiosity about there's got to be more to this than just going out for a run or just on the practice pitch. And so that kind of drove, and then having someone that was really handholding me through seeing bigger picture. Those were the drivers.
What have you seen as far as the metamorphosis of how your brother and a lot of other people and and the different special needs groups that are being received? Through my eyes, I reflect back to when I was young, and certainly was not around a group of people that were ever negatively thinking about that, but it just wasn't really something you interacted with that much. Today, I'm sure the adaptive community coming back from war is part of this, but I feel like it's done a full 180. I mean, I had Nick Nikic on the show, who's the young man with Down syndrome that did the Hawaiian triathlon, the Ironman. So, you're just seeing a completely different representation today than when we were young. But you've obviously got this in your family. What have you seen as far as the way that your brother has been received over the last few decades?
It's funny you mentioned that individual, because when I saw that feat, I could have seen my brother do that. Certainly we weren't there, and triathlon wasn't, it didn't come out till much later, but I definitely could have seen him do that. He actually was a very talented swimmer and runner as well. It was an amazing opportunity, but I have seen a complete change. What you're describing in a lot of ways is the seed change of stigma related to mental health. And we've seen it in so many spaces that it has become a critical mass in a lot of ways. I'm in a country that actually where stigma is very high here in New Zealand. The mental health status of the country is for World Health Organization standards, one of the worst among modern countries.
Really?
However, yes, highest suicide rate, 13 to 35, both male and female.
What's the root of that?
It's a number of different things. And it really, if you track on, what I'm really describing is what's changed in North America that will be the seed change here. I have great hope in that. This is a country that's very capable. It's very possible that they could do it in even a very quick time. But what you see is one of the things I mentioned earlier, a very educated country. So they've done a very good job from a government level teaching about mental health. But when you educate people about mental health, then you also are driving awareness, which will then show up as wanting services and needs, because they recognize within themselves or the people they care about, there's a need. But we do not have enough psychologists in country. And so what you end up having is then people seeking services, not enough people. And if we play that out, we know that people who are on a waiting list, waiting for treatment, any type of treatment, just call it what it is, some people drop out, but almost all get worse. And so when you have this stagnation of not being able to get services, unfortunately, you do not see the trends moving in the right direction. I think on a simple level, that can get solved in many different ways. And then part of my role is to help with that from a grassroots to a parliamentary level. But I think it's very, very doable. I think there is stigma here also from the adopted in many ways from the two blending of the cultures, right? Stiff upper lip, stay calm and carry on. Yeah. And some of that is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I do like that. Some of that is wonderful. But when you take that messaging to the nth degree of ignore, you take it too far. And then we know about First Nation cultures. Many of them don't engage with services for good reasons. They don't have access. It's not culturated to them. We are not messaging in the right ways. We don't meet them where they're at. And there's a level of concern and paranoia because of how they've been treated transgenerationally. So we have to bridge those gaps. And that is our responsibility. And we have to take that seriously and not go, well, that's a you problem. No. That's a we problem. And I think what I saw through the years of growing up, but also growing up in the profession, the US and Canada has done a very good job of reducing a lot of that stigma. And I'll give one of the areas where, two of the areas that I've worked in quite a bit, working in the military. They had a very much an issue with this because mental health, raising your hand and saying you have a concern, would hurt your mission specific readiness. You may not be chosen, but also career advancement. And that had to change. You're at war 20 years. You have to understand there's a hazard to being at war. So if we don't take care of people and acknowledge the level of prevention that needs to be given to people who are doing very, very difficult things, and that there are going to be artifacts of mental health with that, we can't hold them to a negative halo. We need to help them and then allow them to move on in their career. So there was a shift with that. I think they did it in very, it's not perfect, but they did it very fast, I would say. I was kind of surprised by their speed in being able to do that. But I think the command level understood we would not have any troop readiness if we ignore this. And that is likely true. I think the other places in sport, just by my position. So when I started my career, I was the first clinical sports psychologist, one of 7, but the first at that university, one of 7 in the NCA, 1,100 schools, and at that time, 550,000 athletes. Now you look at the number of clinical sports psychologists, registered psychologists working in the sports specialty discipline. And certainly we don't have every school, but we have the majority of schools that either have someone full-time, part-time, or consulting in. When I was in the NFL, I was only one of 4 when I first started my career in 2000. And so we've seen that seed change. And so it is possible, but we have to talk about it. Like, you've given me this platform. Think about what we're talking about. Like, if we go back 20 years, I'll give you an amazing example. So at one point in time, now this is psychiatry, the American Psychiatric Association, someone who was a psychiatrist who was gay he spoke at it in a disguise because he was so fearful of the reprisal from his counterparts and peers and other professionals that he had to go into disguise to talk about homosexuality as not being deviant. That was in the 1970s.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And so when we think about that arc of kind of thinking about holistic health, thinking about people that sleep problems and anxiety or depression are common things, and there are compensatory responses to real life experiences. They have nothing to do with weaknesses. They're just signals. And if we listen to the signals, we can learn how to lean towards resiliency and lessen the burden of that, but increase the resiliency that may not happen again. So now we're talking about neurological resilience. It's amazing where we've come. More to do, though.
Absolutely. Well, you just said the S word, so everyone that listens to this frequently knows exactly what I'm going to ask about next. Sleep.
okay. Ah.
So I want to get to performance. I think this is where this conversation needs to go. You work with so many high performers in uniform and, sports teams. But before we do, the profession that I work in, and I've contrasted this and compared this with a lot of the SF, special operations warfighters I've had on the show. Unlike people like Jeff, who had psychologists, had strength and conditioning coaches, had the latest and greatest technology, and they got to really kind of figure it out and then disseminate it to the rest of the SEAL teams. In the fire service, if you had a psychologist coming, they're coming to say, hey, let's try and help some of them because they're broken. If you have a strength and conditioning coach, it's like, we'll give a talk on how to maybe avoid a heart attack. We're not even close to performance. And this is, a population that's working awake, 2 or 3 days a week, 24 hours at a time. So 24 on, 48 off is the minimum. But then you have the staffing crisis. So now you have, maybe 48 on, 24 off. So talk to me first about, through your lens, without loading the question, the importance of sleep from, whether it's the mental health side, the physical health side, and obviously cognition as well.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that, historically you've anchored here, because there's one thing that all of us have management over every day, and we spend 1/3 of our life in sleep, that we have management over to improve our health and our performance, and they're always interconnected. It is sleep. That is our number one hands down performance enhancer. And is often overlooked. That advantage is given away if we think about from a competitive advantage, but it's also a career maturity advantage for every individual, no matter what profession they're in. And so if we want to have health and that balance, we shouldn't be giving that away. We should be protecting it. And certainly we can talk about naps too, because they're interconnected. Through our chronobiology, both are very interconnected. And that one's probably a tighter neurological pathway that we actually make sure no one gets to do. Except when we're in early grades, right? From a sleep standpoint, and I'm going to speak about some technology that can help some people. And to be very clear, I work as a scientific advisor for some of these companies, but I do not get paid. I've never gotten paid as a scientific advisor. I really see that as a direct conflict. I know I'm leaving money on the table, but I'd rather, because my integrity is not for sale. And I like to be able to speak clearly to technology companies who are really trying to help health and performance when they're not doing science or question the science. Always kind of be probative about that. But if we look at sleep, and we look at your profession and having worked in it, if you're creating disruptions, then you have to start leaning on the prevention side. So prevention saves money, saves talent, saves career maturity, saves opportunities. Doesn't matter if we're talking about pro sport, firefighting, or special operations. And when you start to look at it from a prevention standpoint, you're looking at it from a holistic standpoint. Because if you don't, you will lose talent. And if we think of it from a firefighter standpoint, it's very important you have early career professionals, mid-career professionals, late career professionals. That whole mentoring, right? To be an expert in anything, it just means that you've made every mistake there is to make in a limited bandwidth of the field. If you do not have late career professionals who can mentor because they're broken, how do you then have this pathway of mentorship towards expertise or something that's been around since the medieval times, apprenticeships? That's how higher ed works. It's how I got my doctorate. And so you have to start thinking from a preventative standpoint. So if you're not allowing people to sleep 7 to 10 hours, and that's the healthy range, then we need to be educating about or using technology to augment those circadian rhythms to have stabilization. So one of the ways you can stabilize that is through blue light therapy, a company I've worked with and used quite frequently, and I've used it in elite sport as well as I use it now in New Zealand. Being the head of psychology for high performance sport in New Zealand, our closest competitor is a 3-hour flight, a 2 time zone shift. So why would I give away health advantage and competitive advantage by not adjusting that? So we use a company, AYO. They make blue light glasses. you to help with circadian shifts. They have an app that helps you time it. Where am I going to? When am I landing? So you know when to use the glasses and it just emits a light blue light in your eyes. You don't stare at it. It comes at an angle, almost like the sun. And that's what we're mimicking. We're mimicking frequencies of sunlight to repattern feeling fresh and being on the time zone when you land. Also dealing with jet lag on the way back. The other thing blue light can do is reduce a little bit of your caffeine intake. You can do a session for like 10 minutes and peak your attention span and your alertness, but you're not then waiting for a chemical to get out of your system, which then could disrupt sleep. So we can work shift work if we give people education about sleep and then give them tools to assist with that. Another one is a company, Elemind. So they track your sleep, and then they've learned through their studies in Alzheimer's, which we talked about earlier. So how do we create a non-invasive, passive way to stimulate areas of the brain that have to do with Alzheimer's? Well, you do that through small millivolts through the skull or sound through the ear channel, because the vagus nerve, which connects the brain, the heart, and the gut, if you stimulate it at the right times, you can extend deep sleep or facilitate, falling asleep faster, staying asleep, and really staying away from any disruptions. And so that technology I'll use if people are still having jet lag effects and middle insomnia. So that's that middle portion of sleep. You fall asleep quick, you can stay asleep. Right in the middle of the night, you wake up and you're alert and you can't get back to sleep. This device will sense as you're coming out, stimulate your brain to stay back in. And then another tool I use is Muse S. They're a company that makes a band that can help with reading brainwaves. You can use it for meditation, but it also is pretty much a take-home sleep study in a box. So you look at that sort of stuff, it can give you feedback, but give a practitioner like me feedback. And then we can look at ways to advance your environment, advance how you sleep, when you sleep. So we have these tools now to really protect sleep as its primary health and performance optimizer. But also, so does everyone that's listening. These are very inexpensive, clinical grade consumer technology that they have done the hard yards of science. They're not trying to sell you something that kind of works or looks sciencey. It's legit science that can guide our practice. Because in a modern pretense, we have everything around us that's here to disrupt our sleep. We have full spectrum LED light bulbs that disrupt our sense of what time it is in the day. All of us in our environments. Yes, we're saving money, but if you don't understand how they disrupt chronobiology, that's not good. Our phones are set to disrupt our sleep through brainwave and radio frequency. And so if we give a little bit of education about these things, we can really preserve people's talent. And so it always saddens me that most people, what they do know about sleep, some people have some good knowledge, but most of us have a lot more myths than we actually have knowledge. And then we don't know what products are actually helpful.
One thing I was alluding to was the false economy of the way that we're working our firefighters. And one of the things that I said was lawsuits. Well, obviously there's if there's a fire engine crashes into something, now you've lost $1 million piece of equipment as well. And I've used some examples of large disasters in the past to show, this one incident cost all this money or all these lives. In your book, The Brain Always Wins Too, you've got quite a few of these listed. So talk to me about, some of the biggest tragedies that have been linked to sleep deprivation.
Well, I love where you're going there too, because it's interesting when we talk about paid not to see this stuff, and then you're unwilling to look and you're becoming a bean counter. You're looking at the dollars and cents or the pounds and pence, and you're not willing to see that ROI or loss of ROI. It is a very confusing world. And so I can only imagine the frustration you've experienced, but I'm glad you've pointed these things out because it changes the discussion points, which is critical. There is a cost. Like as you were talking, one of the examples I'll quickly go into, and then the tragedy. So we know for police officers, we look at people of service. If you are constantly keeping them on this shift work, the brain is wired to predict. if an individual is under 7 hours of sleep, they are more likely to see pre-fight indicators in an interaction with a citizen. That's a problem. It's a problem we can solve. Why does the brain do that? First of all, the brain's wired to survive. You're in a situation where at any time something can happen. And when we don't sleep 7 hours, we all get a bit more anxious. It's because the brain knows what it has in its energy bank and it's predicting outwards. So it's also keeping us on our toes to be more hyper vigilant. Well, that's not a great scenario for someone who's got to serve and protect. And so when we don't think about how this affects the brain and think about it from a brain first standpoint, it's easy to ignore everything else. And that happens. But when we look at world tragedies, there are so many seminal moments. I'll talk about one that was recent, not far from where I am in Australia. So one that was really most recent, and we've seen and we know that it takes a lot. It's a very stressful job to be an air traffic controller. It's one of the highest stress jobs. You think about it, one moment at a time and a mishap, and you have carnage on your hands, in the air and on the ground. And so there was an incident in Australia where actually an air traffic controller who had to work 3 shifts, who actually fell asleep on the job. So at that moment, the sky was not being observed. It was not being communicated to. And that also on the ground, lining up to land in an airport, was completely unobserved. And that was easily something that could have been mitigated. You cannot put people in those positions that are under-rested and unavailable from a physical, cognitive, and emotional standpoint. Because I'll bring it back to our listeners. All of us have probably experienced it. If you haven't, I'm very thankful. I've gotten tired driving. And you can get to a state we call micro sleep, where you're actually able to take in some perception of what you're doing. But your reaction time is so poor to your environment and how much information you're taking in and processing that you're pretty much sleeping with your eyes open. That's probably the layman's way I would explain it. And that's basically an incredibly dangerous environment. So we can't be putting people who have to do these high complex jobs in that situation. And working 3 shifts in a row, that will do it. I will absolutely do it. 2 other seminal ones that I'll speak to is the Exxon Valdez. Most people remember that huge damage to the environment in Alaska. And when they drew down on what it was human error related to a lack of rest and a lack of sleep. I'll go with one that dates me a little bit, but that's okay. I'm an old man. But when we look at the Space Shuttle Challenger, that was related to, yes, decision-making that was not clear. That's part of it. But it also was fatigue of a number of individuals who were supposed to do quality control related to. And so when you have this combination of things, they come down to human factors, but often they're related to this fatigue. One that just recently happened, I just thought of, that's not in the book. It happened to the New Zealand Defence Force Navy. So they had not adapted their protocols to the Australian and the US and the UK and the Canadian Navy, where you do shifts. So you are having people who are on shift conning the ship who are rested, who had 7 to 10 hours of sleep. They were working, like, if you think about in the past, because we don't tend to do this anymore in North America, although it depends upon the hospital, of putting doctors on shifts of 32 hours straight. And so they were putting their sailors on shifts of 32 hours straight. And they lost a ship. They ran aground and it sank. And so when we think about that, that's millions of dollars, like you were saying. I think it was 63 million. Might have been more than that, but that's what I recall. And so we can prevent these things. These are completely preventable. I'll give you an example for something that people have seen. And it's if you've seen the movie Lone Survivor, you saw an example of preserving human expertise in the ability to actually act with precision. So when they were in Overwatch and they were just observing the village in the movie, 3 people slept, 3 people are up, and they shift. You teach people at that level that your weapon is your brain. Everything else is complementary. Because if you have the ability to think through and process and decide, then you have better opportunities. Not everyone was up. And that actually was a bit controversial because it was giving away methods and ways of practice. So, but that was live in the movie.
Well, speaking of that, you're talking now forging performance, even though under incredible duress in that particular example. Talk to me about, we've got this lack of cognition. I think one of the things that one of my previous guests said, that when they did the analysis of accidents involving police, fire, EMS vehicles, they said nearly always there was an absence of tire tracks, of skid marks, because of those microsleeps. So they just drove right into the minivan full of kids because they were saving some money and forced someone to work an extra shift. Now, so that's obviously the detrimental side. Talk to me about performance. So just one poor sleep, how has that affected some of these elite teams?
Well, again, one of the things is you think thoughtfully about your plan, and I can compare it to firefighters. Like, so if we know that there are certain demands you have to meet, we can prepare the central nervous system, the neurological system, to be more resilient in the face of it. We can mitigate some of these things. Now, down to the individual, we may not mitigate all of them. Some people we may be able to. There are individual variances and individual differences. But if we know that we're going to be going into a period of high stress where there may be some loss of sleep, why don't we prevent that? Well, of course we do. In pro sport, I used to present the modeling, mathematical modeling for players of what's the return on investment that they're ready. Not that they're improving throughout the season, that they're able to maintain their performance throughout the season. They're not peaking. What's the ROI just on that? The availability for them to produce their talent and what they're good at. And you can produce the right down to the dollar what that is. And so when you think about performance, we have to think about keeping people, yes, advancing at best, but maintaining their talent to be able to execute and plan ahead. One of the worst things that often happens, and we should learn this from military because most sport comes from some history of military. So pre-mortem planning comes from philosophy, but with cognitive science, we kind of understand percentage points of how much we can do by thinking about everything that can go wrong and then having a solution. So if we're looking at shift work, how do we do it in the most humane way to keep those physical, cognitive, and emotional attributes in check and sharp or maintained? We can do that. And so what I look at is what's our planning? And there's a Navy SEAL motto, 3 is 2, 2 is 1, 1 is none. So plan A is good as plan A, B, C, D, and so on and so forth. And so what we do sometimes is we create this ambulance at the bottom of the cliff where we're reactive instead of proactive. High performance is about planning and thinking ahead. It's about preserving talent so people can be ready and continue to grow. So when I think about those sleep cycles, I'll give you an example. We almost had to play a game when I was with the New England Patriots in China. Now, we had 2 years to prepare. Never happened. But in the background, we were planning all the sleeping. We were thinking through all the things that can happen. What's our behavior 3 nights before we get on the plane? What do we do to bank sleep and prepare and enhance neurological resiliency? What do we do on the plane? What do we do when we first get off? And I'll give you an example like a lot of teams will do. Oh, it's a perfect time to immediately go to practice. Are you kidding me? That's the worst thing. You've just done, the plane is not pressurized to sea level. You've just done high altitude training. The best thing to do is fuel, nap, and then maybe if there's time, go do a workout. Otherwise, you're chancing injury or learning things that you're never going to use because the brain doesn't unlearn. And so if we think through things, we can prevent talent loss and preserve opportunities. And I think that's where we miss out. We're like, oh, it'll take care of itself. No, that's not how it works. It's not how it works. The other way is with sleep, you also can work through the gut, the enteric nervous system, which is the second largest nervous system in our body next to our brain. And so we can work in all these multitude of ways to preserve sleep and then what we feel on the other side of that. So just think it through. Plan, plan, plan.
You mentioned learning. I want to get to the gut biome as well. But before we do, when I did sports science, we're talking a long time ago in London, I remember them
You're good.
saying, saying, teaching us that, you would do the skill, you would do the repetitions, but it was actually when you slept that you processed the skill. Now you come
Yes.
from obviously, a group of athletes that are forging a literal 1% gain in their skill to try and just squeeze out their opposition. But I'm from a profession that's literally the first responder Swiss Army knife. We do fire and we do EMS here. So everything from the medical to the rope rescue to the extrication to the fires, we're it. Massive skill set, but also woefully sleep deprived. So talk to me about the importance of sleep when it comes to learning and actually being a better professional in your sport or your career.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and what you learned there, we've just gotten more subtle and nuanced in the knowledge about what happens there. But absolutely, is the practice is basically a stimulation for the learning. The learning doesn't encode until you sleep, and especially deep sleep. And so what we're having there is a memory encoding, basically tau proteins and protein synthesis. And so when we move through that full channel of recovery, brain first cleans itself, pairs itself, myelinates and connects memory, then moves on to all the other 11 systems. So what we do now in a lot of ways is you want to benchmark training with a significant recovery cycle. So what we're trying to produce there is a peak in gamma waves in the brain. So gamma waves have to do a lot with that deep, thoughtful learning. And so we want to benchmark immediately with recovery. Yes, it may be primary nutrition, like hydration and nutrition, but that just is neurotransmission. So we're just strengthening the learning process. So post something you want to fuel, but then you want to get good rest. An example of this in a lot of academic institutions now, from among their master's and doctoral programs, you have nap rooms. Thoughtful work, thoughtful learning, take a nap. I teach my student athletes that who are in the system, in the Olympic system here. And then when I was working the NCAA, because they are student athletes, you can use your fitness level to enhance your learning. Do a set of push-ups and sit-ups because it doesn't take a lot to push blood flow when you're fit. Right? Then study, then take a 20-minute to 45-minute nap and code. So close proximity of coding. You also can use, sensory deprivation floating to enhance learning. So training, learning, floating. Benchmark those two things together, and what you have are magnifications of increased learning processes. And so you're touching on something that you learned back then, still solid now. Our interventions have grown, our knowledge has grown on it, but we often muck that up. We often don't pair them together in close proximity. And I can give you an example from elite military. They've known this for a long time because you talk about multiple skill sets that you guys have in your current, environment of firefighting, which is significant. And I appreciate you teaching me that. That is significant. That's not the same everywhere. But if we look at some of the special operations team, they may have to know multiple languages. All right. So how do you encode language learning quickly? Learning and then sleep or floating. It enhances that process. And this is stuff is not locked away in journal articles that can't be seen by the public. Some of the military research I did will never see the light of day, or if it does, it'll be seen down the road. But some of this research is out there. Now, again, this is why also we wrote the book, The Brain Always Wins too. And The Brain Always Wins was some of this gets locked away and doesn't get talked about. Science is a gift for all of us. So the techniques and tactics I'm talking about, we should all know these. These should be gifts. Science is a gift. So I appreciate what you're saying, but we don't often benchmark them together, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, I think that's how you break through some of the naysayers. So like I said, the chest beating dude that grew the mustache and bought the leather helmet and, I'll just work the shifts that I work, and, mental health is for the weak and all this absolute bullshit that you hear some of these idiots talking about. The way that you get through to them, I think, is performance. And I'll be interested to get your take on this. I had a guy on the show, Logan Gelbrick, who was a professional baseball player, and he talked about one of his flow state moments. And he said, you need three things. He said, you need, the repetitions of the skill, which, as we progress through our career, we start to have as firefighters. You need high stress. Well, yeah, that's inbuilt. There's no question about that. And he said, and you need a calm mind. And I was like, well, ding, 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 ding. That's what we don't have. So then if you want to reframe what I've been saying is, if you want to reframe many of the things that work on the mental health side, let's talk about performance. You wake up at 3 a.m, you get on the rig, you drive to the fire, you make entry through a ladder, through a window on a second floor, and now you're searching for a child. But you haven't done the work, and you're sleep deprived, and your mind is busy. I would imagine it's impossible to get in the flow state where we can really read the room with our, the braille, as it were. So if I am correct, talk to me about what is needed to get into a flow state, and are we blocking that by the way that we're working and not accepting some of these mental health tools that we know work on the other side?
It's a great question. I'm also going to do a little bit of kind of piecing together of what we do know about flow. So flow, what we understand is more of distally. So Csikszentmihalyi's research is actually, he was very fearful of really committing hard science to his theory. And like a lot of theories, because it seems true and seems accessible, it blew up. But the science on it is not very good. Because the very fact, if I have to go through 9 things to get into a flow state, it doesn't describe a lot of great, amazing things that people do, including in firefighting. I always find it interesting when you talk to someone who's done something really dramatic, you'll find their eyes will go up and to the left because they're creating a story. They have no idea how it happened. It's an efficient state on the brain of an altered state of consciousness. And that's the best we know, even though we have flow states that date back to 1700s coming from warfare. It is just an efficient state on the brain. So flow is much more of not a pinpoint, but a range. Because we're so resilient as human beings, if it took us to pinpoint to perform at the highest level, we wouldn't have survived as a species. So it's a distal explanation. But to go to your question, which is really foundational, can you perform within that range with some of the factors you gave me? Underslept, underpracticed, or under-rehearsed, just maybe through that particular skill or that particular scenario, not saying unskilled, but in that particular scenario. And then certainly overwhelmed with high pressure. Yeah, so I go back to, are we practicing alike elements that will transfer? Because if we're not practicing alike elements that will transfer, we're not going to have management of pressure, which is emotions come first in sport and life. So it's an emotional response, which cues pattern recognition, which then allows someone to access physical and cognitive attributes of reading the room and then being able to do. Because really what it comes down to, high performance is this on the brain level: see, feel, do. That's it. You did it today. I did it today. And everyone that's listening has probably done it today. You've driven somewhere and you have no idea how you got there. The only time you have any reference of it is that maybe you got detoured and you had to think through new steps or new ways to go if your GPS isn't on, or you've gotten into a state of frustration and road rage. Otherwise, we don't remember it. That is a range of efficiency. And a way of understanding that is, if you've ever had to teach someone to drive, you then forget about steps, processes, things to do, because it's high performance is stored in an area of the brain that you cannot consciously access. That's why if you teach firefighting, you have to almost regain your declarative knowledge and study that a bit to make sure you don't leave anything out. And so what I would say is the factors you gave me are defeating that. It's not that you can't do the job. There are failure points though, but you can't do the job. It's we should be setting people up for more success, and we should simulate in ways that are safe. So once they're in that environment, they can even be faster at learning their environment and accent it.
Brilliant. Well, circling around, we talked about, the gut-brain connection. Firstly, some firehouse cooking is amazing. So some of the meals I've had have been fantastic, nutritious and healthy and all the things. But, some of the firehouse food is also terrible. And then the high concentration of calls that we get, sometimes it's an uncrustable in an EMS room in a hospital somewhere. So talk to me first again about this gut-brain connection and how that affects both, longevity and performance.
It's a great question, and I too have had great meals in a firehouse before as well, and I remember them fondly. There is many a time sitting and I thought more about this coming into this podcast. So I'll thank you immediately, and I will answer your question with that gift you've given to me. It's brought back amazing memories of being at the firehouse. First of all, we're still drilling down on this. I think the military is a bit ahead from other places, but the enteric nervous system has been kind of ignored in a lot of ways, in the sense that what goes in gets processed for neurotransmission. Yes, we get this gift now of eating for ambiance and preference and taste. But the only reason why we have taste buds was to identify poisonous foods. But also the only reason why we ate is to produce neurotransmission. That's still the primary goal, right? And so if we can't create neurotransmission from things traveling from the brain to the gut, then we're not going to have firings in the way that's going to preserve our talent, but also preserve our ability to learn. And so really, when we look at this, it's critically important that we understand nutrition, and nutrition is very individualized. This is another thing we've gotten wrong. Everything in performance and health is individualized. For instance, we can use the simplest example. I think we might have used it in the book, but I could eat a carrot and have an allergic reaction. You could eat a carrot and be able to digest all the vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates, all the breakdown of the chemistry in a much more efficient way. So we have to understand it's not one size fits all. That's immediately where we get it wrong. And there are opportunities we all have now with simple, accessible science with our general practitioner doctors of sampling. And again, it's just, hopefully it's not TMI when they have commercials in the United States of like, here, do your business in a box and ship it in, right? So that test is actually one of the things we can understand. How do we process our foods? How is our nutrition individualized? And I would give an example to everyone. You can go to your GP, and there's another company. I get nothing for this, but I know the accuracy of their test. Thorne Research does some testing with fecal matter and can look at your profile and look at that and look at it over time, because you need some good sampling. But then we can draw.
They're one of the sponsors of the show, and I did a poo sample. But just one, though. I haven't done sampling over time. But yeah, apparently my poo was great. I disagree what I saw in the toilet, but they seem to be impressed by
it. And again, if you can get people past this piece of like, listen, what comes in and goes out tells us a lot. And I've done a lot of that in collision sports and the military. We can then understand how to prescribe nutrition at just in time. We learned how to adjust nutrition going on mission or going into games. I'm doing that here in New Zealand. We can get a better understanding of how we address higher stress. Because I'll give you an example, and you said it really wonderfully, that when you have higher stress, what does it do to the gut? Well, you can imagine it flushes things out that we essentially need. Cortisol is a very important neurotransmitter. It's not a negative thing, just like inflammation. It's just a signal. And when that signal predominates too high, then it can flush other really essential neurotransmitters out, like serotonin, which has to do with mood, memory, and movement. Pretty important stuff. And if any of us become low normal serotonin, all of those are going to be off a bit. Well, if we have the science to really kind of dial that in and give people the empowerment of knowing, okay, what are serotonergic or serotonin-rich foods like kiwi fruit? What are ways I can protect my gut so it doesn't get leaky, like with high amounts of fiber, right? Or moderate amounts of fiber, depending on the person, right? We can really give people opportunities to be on the front foot. That if I know if I'm going to be under high stress, how do I dose? Basically, food is medicine. How do I dose my medicine to produce a different response under high stress? We also forget this piece about nutrition. So let's say you've come off a call. You can decide the grade of stress, but there's stress, there's stimulation. And actually, I don't even like that term because it's a very subjective term. It's actually trauma. Is it a small T or a big T? We want it to be a small T because we can work it through. Big T's take more interventions. But what's immediately on the other end of that is digestion differences. So if we think about our autonomic nervous system, we refer to it as sympathetic, which means go, 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 and parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. So if we're still go, 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 we should probably be doing an intervention to get us calm before we go eat. So everyone's had this experience of their stomach shrinking or that feeling of our stomach. That's blood flow. If you're sympathetically driven, you've just had a threatening situation or you're just go, 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 everything went fine, but it was go, go, go. Likely to do diaphragmatic breathing, do a relaxation session, listen to some calming music and just close your eyes, then go eat. Your fueling system will open up more. And thus you get now digesting the energy you need in the neurotransmission. And so we forget about these pairings.
Did you ever look, I think we talked about it when we spoke last, that company Newcom that I told you about? See, that is, they have these 20-minute sessions, and that's something that I've said not so much before a meal. I mean, what you've just said is new to me, and that makes perfect sense because, yeah, if you're stressed out, you're not wanting to eat at that moment. And then with the acute stress, the burnout, that was one of my symptoms, was that kind of, loose stool, as it were. Yep. But at the end of a shift before you go home, I think if I was still on the fire service now, I would do this every single time. Go back into the bunk room or sit in your car in the parking lot, somewhere where you feel safe, put the headphones on and the eye mask and just do a 20-minute session, because it down regulates you. It's not, you don't even have a choice. Whether you're stay awake, whether you're kind of skipping through theta, whatever state you're in, it's down regulating you. So the same thing. And if you had a big incident, especially if you're allowed to go out of service for a little bit, do one of those sessions first and then go and eat. So yeah, I like that a lot.
And that's the benchmarking, like we talk about. If you're going to do stimulation, there's got to be rest. Laws of physics apply in all of our humanity and neuroscience and psychology. So if we think about a cosine, it goes up and it goes down. Everyone's doing it right now. I'm doing it. You're doing it. Inhale is actually a stress response. Blood pressure goes up, vitamin and minerals to the brain, neurotransmission. As we exhale, that's a state of relaxation. We are at our best when we mimic that cosine. And we have high variability, a lot of this really connected. And you coming off a shift or coming off a call, that gets shorter in amplitude and closer together. And some states in chronic stress, it gets wider apart, our variability. Anything that has a heartbeat, you want high variability. And you talked about a transition. I would encourage anyone coming off a shift, and it also helps to shift if you're going home, to be a spouse, be a father, be a mother, is to create a transition where you are in a recovery state before you even leave. Yes, it's an excellent way of doing it. When we're looking at high-performing athletes or elite operators, you're teaching them to be a scientist of themselves, and that with every stimulation that you have that creates this small T of hopefully turns into learning, you have to benchmark it with points of recovery, which include hydration, nutrition, and bringing the central nervous system down. So I might encourage them to do HRV biofeedback or resonant breathing. There's great technology out there for that with thought technology, heart math, and heart-space health. And those can guide you through that. You can do it through meditation with Muse, but build a practice of, if you're going to get intense, you also have to come down. Otherwise, you train your central nervous system to only do one thing well. And we need variability. And I love that you shared that practice. That's smart, brilliant, absolutely what should be done.
Yeah, I mean, it is truly brilliant. And this, I think, is the only technology in the world that has a patent for down regulating the nervous system, like from the parasympathetic, to parasympathetic with the brain itself. One more area, then I want to go to some closing questions so I can be mindful of your time. You talk about, the social side as well in the book. I think the most kind of, the low hanging, most important conversation with this is social media and its impact on relationships. Again, especially some of these younger athletes that may have been raised looking at a screen rather than looking in someone's eyes. So just a kind of overall conversation, talk to me about, what you're seeing as far as some of these technologies, and then, versus what is needed to forge, whether it's these elite war fighters or these elite athletes.
It's a lot of things to unpack there. It's a really good question. I think one of the pieces I would speak to immediately, because you started there, was if anyone really wants to understand the closest proximity to the latest data of understanding how mental health is actually fracturing our health, the U.S. Surgeon General in 2023 released a report. There's an executive summary, and then if you really want to go for a deep dive, please plan something fun after it, because it is not a fun read. And make sure that thing maybe even has to do with social connection, because the data that we have, because most of the social media companies in the United States no longer allow us to have access, or social science researchers have access to that data to see how it's impacting youth as well as adults. And so this was before they closed the door. To be honest, we don't need all the data to make a conclusion. This is an epidemic, and it is harmful to our health. If we don't digest it in the right amounts and create caveats, it's basically like handing someone a hammer with no rules how to use it. And so one of the primary social psychologists has even said, who's cited in the U.S. Surgeon General's report, I would rather have my son and daughter have a smoking and drinking habit. And so to frame it that way, it is divisive to our health. One of the reasons is you highlighted, and we see this off the back of COVID as well, because that put us onto screens. Now, some of that was good. I'm very thankful you and I can do this today. I'm thankful that I do some hybrid work with athletes worldwide when they leave our shores here in New Zealand, but we work with them here, and then they may have to go on a trip. If they want to connect in, we have this space. However, spending time on screens, we lose social emotional learning. And so what do I mean by that? We are social beings. We predict. So learning facial cues, learning how empathy is displayed in pitch and tone and facial reaction and posturing is very, very important to selecting those groups of people we want to put around us. So if we get really poorer digestion or doses of social emotional learning, this is how we regulate. So we get less regulation as a human being, less understanding of ourselves, less understanding of the other, less understanding of our communities. So it's a critical factor that we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but we can teach people how to use it in ways that can be beneficial. And it's normally in shorter doses. And so I'll go to a performance environment. We know that athletes who access their social media within 48 hours, not even right up to the event, that gets it worse, but 48 hours before, tend to have more anxiety about the event than someone who doesn't. So we educate our athletes, and this is difficult because there's sometimes brand managers. They do have to post. They have to be present. Otherwise, they don't get their funding. So we have to find workarounds that someone else handles that. We offset that interaction. But if we know that, you can imagine what the dosing of anxiety is. The other thing is that social media is working off of frequencies to push certain brainwaves and certain emotional responses, and those things don't help them. Just to give an example, Steve Jobs understood when he was designing a smartphone what he was going for. He loved the modeling of cigarettes and caffeine. How do I get the person addicted? Well, that's through radio frequency and light frequency. Then when you add in the other pieces about likes and everything, what we have is an experiment, a mass experiment that's been done on the world where no one's assigned an informed consent of being involved with being manipulated and distorted in their own experience.
I didn't realize Steve Jobs was that aware of all the downstream effects.
Yes. I happen to know one of the members of his Ford team because if it was 40 people that designed a smartphone, we wouldn't see it today. And one of them was a neuroscientist, and they were asked to look at how to create light dynamics and interaction to spend more eyes and thumbs on. Now, others in the social media space have amplified that and turbocharged that. However, we started from a position, and there was a reason why the iPhone never came with a manual. Because you'd have to put disclaimers.
Crazy.
You'd have to be transparent.
Yeah, and you watch that film, The Social Dilemma, and those programmers that were behind it that you could see were kind of racked with guilt now. And they said, look, I'll be completely honest, I don't let my children use this app. And I designed it, so yeah, it's yep. And then a lot of the people I've talked to on the the mental health struggles of our children, every single time I ask them, and it's an open question. It's always, well, the first thing is social media. So yes. Compared to, childhood trauma and the other things that we know are going to be present too, that is the thing that they're talking about primarily, is amplifying all these struggles.
Well, if you think about it, if we go back to, and we're a similar generation, we have the same worries about TV. And there is an impact, and there can be a positive impact. But TV wasn't designed particularly. The medium is the message. But it wasn't designed to dramatically manipulate brainwave through certain frequencies and dynamics of light. This strategically was. And another way to think about TV, and we can walk it over to social media, it's called programming. So what are we programming? We never had these thoughtful kind of distillations like that. Mm-hmm. So what is social media's ultimate mission of what they're programming? And if you look at that, another way to kind of unpackage that, and I remind people in New Zealand of this. So almost all the social media companies are based in the US. TikTok isn't, but you'll have some branch there that is. The US doesn't get the worst version of social media. Everybody else does. And so when you think about what you're digesting there, and it has these harmful effects, and then you think about elsewhere in the world gets worse programming, where do we end up? This is so much of an issue, and this is something that I'll say I'm happy that the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, has done, but they tend to be slow to regulate or slow to protect people. They've seen the last two Olympic cycle, the online abuse toward female athletes is significant. So much so they've put money towards researching it and then interventions. That'll tell you. In just 2 cycles, they decided, and if you look at the last time they regulated something that had to do towards the harm of their athletes, you're going to look at a very, very long stretch of time. So they move very quickly. They tend to spend more time trying to evaluate it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they could see clearly how dangerous this was for the next generation of female athletes.
I saw a story a while ago, and I think I've got this right, that in Australia, they'd banned social media till the age of 16. Is this something that you're mirroring in New Zealand as well?
They're certainly considering it. When you're close neighbors and you both share a lot of values from a societal level to community level to family level, and quite similar in a lot of ways, that we take nods from each other. It goes back and forth. So certainly I would say it's being considered at the parliamentary level. We're educating it amongst our elite athletes, because if we don't, we're going to continue to have one of these great complexities that influence things in the wrong direction. But also they become peer-to-peer learning. For our elite athletes can teach the next pathway down and the next pathway down. We start to create this subtly different way of interacting. Again, I don't think we'll put the toothpaste back in the tube. That's going to take huge parliamentary and governmental levels of regulation. But we can teach people to use it in ways that aren't harmful.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I want to go to some closing questions, but before we do,
sure.
Your book, The Brain Always Wins 2, What made you guys write it initially? And then, what can people expect now with this revised edition?
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. It's partly about some of the things we've talked about today. Chris Parker, co-author, and I feel very, very passionately about this. And I said it earlier today in this conversation because it's just, I think, a part of both of our ethos. Science is a gift, and it's far too often locked up in peer-reviewed journals and written in technical jargon that doesn't allow people to excessively have that gift and receive that gift. And I think it's a mandate, I feel it, for every scientist and to give back in that way. Distill the research down at every level. Don't get me wrong. I do think as scientists, we have to speak at the 50,000 foot level. And jargon is a part of every profession. You could speak some of your jargon from firefighting, and I would sit here and go, that is like Swahili, please translate. And that's okay. It's about quick communication, distilling down big concepts into small, certain bite-sized things. But we should be able to talk about it in an accessible 500 foot level because that's who we serve. We do this for humanity. And so we wrote the book because as we sat down and talked about it, he was asking me questions conversationally, just like you and I have exchanged. And I think most things come from, good things come from conversation. And it came clear to him because he anchors on communication. He worked as a professor at Nottingham Trent University. He was brought into sports science because they were finding their graduates couldn't teach people what they did. And he's like, well, that's about a campaign of narrative. You need to be able to talk at every level about what you did, not just at the highest level. And so he instituted this communications program so everyone could talk about what they did at every level. And so it's something near and dear to him, but it's near and dear to me. So I had no thoughts of ever writing a book. I've written chapters, technical chapters, and peer review articles. I had no imagination of it. So it's clearly anchored on, he's written numerous amounts of books. I think we're well over 20 now, in many different genres, but really kind of a great partnership of going, okay, how do we tell a story that can be engaging to teach people about science? So that was really the thrust of it. And I'm still very passionate about it. To this day, I've only heard one scientist ever say that should be part of our mission. And it was someone from NOAA in the US, of really understanding kind of, we need to talk about weather because of how it impacts and you connects into your world, tragedies and crises and unfortunate situations that weather can bring us more and more, fire, earthquakes, these sort of things. And she said, we can't just speak about it in technical terms. We need to meet people where they're at and present the gift so they can inform themselves and empower themselves. So that was the first thing. The other thing is I'm very passionate about the brain. The most complex thing known in the universe, but we don't get much time to understand how it works and why it works as it does. And we don't get much understanding of how we have the power. We don't have control over anything. That's an illusion. But what we do have is management and influence over everything. And that's pretty damn powerful when you consider we have control over nothing. And yet, a human species, we've made it to this point. And so for me, teaching people how they can empower themselves and understand themselves greatly is something that I think Chris and I are both passionate about. I think for the new book, what we've added in is we've added in much more of the conversation to see the information in even a more accessible way. What we've done is also expanded all the chapters to, okay, now how do I take this learning in a human varied way? And what sort of choices do I have to apply this stuff? So we've added much more contextualized, activities and opportunities to engage. And then I would say the third thing we've talked a little bit about, we wanted to put technology in the first book, but we felt like it'd be a bridge too far. Also, we've moved that much farther with the neurotechnologies being much more clinical grade and much more accurate and much more transparent in what they can do and what they can't do. And so adding that piece was clearly important to us because there are tools out there that can help all of us. And many of them are quite inexpensive when you think pennies on the dollar or a pound on the pence of how it could help us. And so that's an addition. I think the other piece I'm really big on, don't live in the book. It's not about living in the book. It is adding even more to other things you can read at multiple levels, other things you can listen to, other things you can watch that we've vetted, that we're like, this is really good science, and it's approachable. And so we wanted it to be a journey. I think if you're trying to be living in the book, I think it comes to a place where it feels far too guru-like. And I don't believe in gurus.
I think, I mean, just as a reader, it was a phenomenal book. Again, when people bring it down to kind of layman's terms, it allows the average person to then absorb all these things and then critically think. And this is what's happened with me with 1,100 plus conversations and, numerous books that I've read from the guests, is it all goes into this little, meat grinder in my head. And then when needed, it'll spit out like, oh, actually, this is the thing. I remember this conversation. Whereas if it'd all been, highbrow literature, I just would not be able to read it. I wouldn't be absorbing it. So I think there's, as you said, you read multiple things about this as a firefighter. You start learning about, neuroscience and sleep deprivation and, strength and conditioning and injuries and physical therapy. And you put it together and then you look at your ecosystem and go, wait a second, this is not lining up. There's some things that we should be doing differently. So this is why I love books like yours, is the rest of us that aren't, very, steeped in academia are able to absorb the principles, the takeaways, and then curate the way that we think as well.
And you don't have to be steeped in academia. That's the thing. Science is a gift. It should be accessible to every one of us. And it really distresses me when we don't make it accessible. And then we stand back and we go, well, they should just know. Well, you can't tell people to do their best unless you show them how, and you have to meet people where they're at. And in some ways, it makes me a better educator because I'm a scientist practitioner, which means I meet with people, I sit with them, I work with them. And working with them, you understand that we are all amazingly built with resiliencies. But it's how do we cross that bridge and connect? So if I'm sitting there going, well, why can't you just read the academic literature? That's not appropriate. If I sat with you, what I'm always amazed about is expertise is everywhere. Yes, I'm not a firefighter. My brother was a paramedic and I trained as a paramedic, but we never fought fires. I could spend time with you and you would bring great joy because it would bring me back to those times being in the firehouse and teach me where it's evolved. We have to be more curious about there's expertise everywhere, but we just got to connect. And it shouldn't be this elitist thing. It's just information. It's just knowledge. It's what Chris Parker would say and was in the book. And we debated about putting in the first book. And I was like, that's got to go in. It's wisdom of the village. Why do we carry these traditions through? Because they've met the test of time, but also now the test of science. And there's something brilliant about that in every environment. So it's just about connection. It's interesting the discussion we've had today, because I was just like thinking through some other things like sleep deprivation and what we don't learn about that. But it's just think about families that have kids. If you educate it a little bit better when you have a newborn, how to protect that. Mm-hmm. Like what happens on the endocrine level, what happens at the gut level, what happens at the cognitive level, that your brain starts to shrink after, 3 weeks of sleep deprivation, but you can get it back. So how do you get it back? And so all this little stuff, we can make big differences.
It's interesting as well, because I need to see studies or show me the data used as a deliberate roadblock as well. And I think that when you're immersed in the dissemination of information, like within your book, the average person then can go either A, oh, you're absolutely right, we do need to study this more before we move forward, or B, in the example I've given earlier, a 56-hour work week is less healthy than a 42-hour work week. Do we really need studies, or are you just stalling and stalling and stalling? So I think this is what's nice, is you can see, okay, well, or in many cases, well, look, there's all this sleep medicine information on the shipping industry and the Navy and Navy SEALs and the Army and aviation and trucking and et cetera, et cetera. There is the information out there. And then, well, give me some examples of when things gone wrong. Okay, well, then in this book, there's 8 pages full of disasters that cost millions and millions and millions of dollars. So I think this is it, is, then you can really kind of stand your ground when you do not need any more data. There's enough out there. Or in some cases, okay, yeah, we need to study more. But for example, do we need more studies on the fact that social media is detrimental to children? I think we're there. I think we've got enough.
Yeah, we're there. And I would say one of the a number of the wonderful questions you've asked relates to this piece is it's always a yes and. The data helps because you're not standing on sand. As you said, you're standing on solid ground. But the other piece that's a yes and, it has to do with building connections. People don't care what you know until they know you care, or you understand what they care about. And so if we don't make connections, information does not necessarily connect as well. That's why it's a narrative. That's why it's a campaign. That's why it's a consistency of messaging and connection. And to go to a bit of a side here, we know this. Most of our marketing is based upon companies that understand the neuroscience of influence. They've been using it against us forever. They know how many commercials to show someone before they get off the couch and order a pizza. They know how many exposures. And so if we start to use that intention for good, we can start to create some influence, not perfectly, not a hit rate of 100%, but can our hit rate go up? But you need the facts before you can tell a good story and have a good campaign. And so I think it's always a yes and your questions reflected that today. We have to connect to human beings. Otherwise, we're not going to make dramatic change.
Absolutely. I think this is the beautiful thing about podcasts and all these conversations is it's, you hear this over and over again from these people from all these different backgrounds that are storytelling and, using that narrative along with the science. Eventually there is that critical mass and the individual goes, you know what? This actually starting to make sense to me now. I think I'm going to look deeper, or I'm going to take this to my department or whatever it is. So yeah. And I think my whole thing now is this punk rock revolution of kindness, compassion, and community. I think that's the most, rebellious thing you can do these days, is to start pulling people back together again. And that messaging has taken a long time too, because we look at the divisive, deliberate use of neuroscience to separate this nation for the last, arguably 5, if not a lot longer, years.
Yes. Yes. And again, it is using science to understand that. But also science we can call that back. If we understand how the mechanisms work, we certainly can use our intentions for good. And that's the thing. Science should be used with good intention. And certainly there's a history of falling down. And we need to acknowledge that. It's almost full circle to our conversation at the beginning. If we don't acknowledge our mishaps and we don't acknowledge that we've changed and we've needed to because of X or Y, then why should people trust? And that also has to do with scientific literacy. That I don't blame on people. I often will blame my own science, that psychology has not done a good job teaching people what we do and how we do it, that it falls on us. Yes, you're not going to get everyone to listen, but that shouldn't be the expectation. The mission should be about science is used for good intention, and this is why we use it, and that we can use it for good intention, and we can bond people together, and we can shine our light in different ways. I think we can make dramatic change with those sort of things. And my hope is that every day I get up and that's my mission. It's people. And anytime I move off of that people matter first and they're more important than technology and hardware, then I got to come back to center. And I thank you for the opportunity, because I think you're right. The podcasts offer that other truth grounded fact base. It's like you're saying, is who do you listen to? And I think that's the death of expertise, as Tom Nichols talks about. Who are you listening to? What's their background? Are they admitting to what bias is? Are they educating from a place of strength? Or what are they trying to sell you? I'm not trying to sell anything. It's just these are the facts as we know them. And when I state an opinion, I will state it as an opinion. Now, it's usually formed by facts, but there's a difference. There's a big difference.
Absolutely. Well, I want to go to some closing questions quickly before I let you go. We've talked about your book, sure, and we'll talk about where people can find that in just a moment. Are there books that you love to recommend written by other people?
There are actually probably a series that I really appreciate, which starts us from the beginning, actually, because I talked about how often people feel philosophy is something of the past, where actually every science came from philosophy. It's a search for the truth. And it gave birth to many sciences: medicine, psychology, neuroscience, military tactics, business operations. And so we think it's lost, but actually epistemology or Stoic philosophy is pretty important to us. So I tend to recommend some of the Ryan Holiday put out a book, 3 books actually. One which I think is seminal for this time in the world, and one is Courage is Calling. And so that piece of really anchoring on integrity. What does it mean? What is integrity? How do you live it? How is your word your bond? Discipline is destiny. Really looking at how we arrange our environments and what the Greeks would call a loci of learning. That how we construct our environments will cue us to the behaviors and the emotions and the thoughts that live more in line with virtue and value. And so his series of books, which are really nice for people who don't love reading, but love the idea of reading, but also I think the chapters are very impactful because they're a story of these modern day stories benched up to the philosophy and then the principles. Each chapter is only about 10 pages or less. They're designed as a meditation, really just to prompt thoughtful consideration, very much based upon Marcus Aurelius's book of Meditations. And so I think he's done a very, very wonderful job of this series of 3. Those are the 2 books I think about quickly because they really anchor on how things we talk about, social media is trying to disconnect us, but also confuse us about our routines of life, about what's virtuous, but also this idea we're getting confused about what is integrity. It's not popularity.
Absolutely.
And so I think those are two powerful books right now. The other one I would think about is a book called Fluke. And I'm trying to think, Brian Klaas, Klaas, I believe. And he became viral. And he's a social scientist when he was at Davos. And this is about 3, maybe 5 years ago. And he made a statement that was very provocative, but it was very anchored in truth. That he had sat on several panels, sat in a number of kind of workshops on that conference. And he made this statement, and it's fitting for the world you come from. He said, I feel like I'm at a conference of firefighters and no one's talking about how to get water to the fire. We're avoiding the very issues we need to be talking about, which is taxing the wealthy so we don't create an evaporation of the middle class and Gilded Age. But his book Fluke is about something that I've studied at a postgraduate level, which is complex systems. So when you were asking me questions earlier, and often people anchor on simple answers to complex problems, that's not the case. Everything is complex. As a human being, we are a complex system in a complex system. So how do we understand how complex systems work to understand the most important variables? Like I said earlier, you don't have to know them all. You have to know the ones that move the system. And often in complex systems like weather, small things make great change. So it's understanding those small things that make great change. And so when I was answering some of your questions, I was thinking about what moves the system for greater change, as opposed to we have to know everything. In fact, most situations we can't, but we can know the factors that move things. And then we can then anchor on how to make resiliency. Efficiency is a bit of a lost leader. That's always there. But if you don't make the system more resilient and people more resilient, it'll always break. And he talks about that with common examples, and it's written in an accessible way. And so I think it anchors people on the truth that some of the questions about health human performance and vitality of cultures are complex, but we can understand them and we can fall less for simple answers.
Fantastic. What about films and documentaries?
Oh God, now we got to go by genre, but that's all right. You've touched on something I do like to watch because in one of my degrees as an undergraduate was in journalism and also understanding how to use media as the message. And so I really love docos and then understanding some of the data is left on the ground floor, or the cutting room floor, I should say. Oh God. Probably one of the things that I really appreciate drilling down on is the lack of moral ambition of our companies worldwide. So some of the docos on Enron, some of the docos on Theranos, those things show that, okay, there's a disconnection to social connection. There's a disconnection to what I do has a social import. And then I'll go to, sport docos that go to that, looking at, concussion in sport, looking at the selection process, looking at how we don't really we speak to the ideals of sport, but do we live them? So it's any of those docos really kind of speak about, to me, we're failing in this mission. And so how do we get to the other side? And so unfortunately, you're getting an old man trying to recall titles, but I would say it generally falls in those, because it reminds me of my mission. It reminds me we're failing. I'll give you an example. I've got a manuscript prepared, and in this manuscript, I put together a timeline of all the abuses towards athletes from 1940 to the current time. It's many pages where we failed. And if we don't face that stuff like in docos and put it front and center, we'll continue to fail it. It may not be an inspiring read, but we have to also look at who we are as human beings. And so we have to look at that stuff. Otherwise, we're not looking at truth, because people love their illusions. And so I love docos in that way. It makes us have to look at ourselves in a sense of humanity. Yeah, my apologies. I'm not pulling out the titles, but again, old man, not enough caffeine in my system.
No problem. I think we talked about this when we spoke before, but this is something I've been thinking about recently. You mentioned some of these large companies. I mean, William Morris and Purdue Pharma and DuPont that have literally, their products have cost in cigarettes, for example, I think per year it's 8 million smoking related deaths around the world, excuse me. And the fact that these people can sleep at night knowing that they are accumulating wealth at the expense of American or, international lives is disgusting. But when you take a step back, to me, it's the mental health crisis that we're not talking about. The narcissistic president or the CEO of a drug company that put out OxyContin. That's a sociopath there. That's someone who, is not feeling empathy, compassion. And therefore, are they fit for duty, as we would say in my profession, to be a fire chief, to be, the president, whatever it is, if they don't have the attributes that you need for a leader? So I find that, maybe that will be the next step, is actually looking at the heads of all these governments and agencies and companies that are literally predatory on the people they're supposed to be serving, in many cases, if they're, in government. And doing a kind of, fit for duty check on them. They'll take a police officer off the street immediately if he says he's struggling. Well, what about someone who has no issue with thousands and thousands of children being killed, for example? So to me, that's a very barely tapped conversation that we need to look at, that I think will answer a lot of the, well, why the hell conversations that we keep having.
I love the things you just touched on there, and I can unpackage it a little bit. And I do remember our initial conversation about some of these things. So thank you for triggering that. One of the things you just talked about, DuPont with the PFAS and how that affects all firefighters. And I actually reflected on this a little bit as we're coming on this podcast again, spending time at the firehouse. I remember playing in spray foam as a child. So I've been exposed to certainly not your level or my father's level, but multiple times, and no one knowing any different, but yet the company knew the harm that it could do. Yeah. The Sackler family and pharmaceuticals and the opioid epidemic. Absolutely. there is science to bear on this, that we know that that most CEOs score very high on psychopathy, meaning that their concern for society is not as great as the concern for themselves or their board or the profit margin, or add more to that. And some of that goes back to the culture. So if we look at those coming out of business schools in the United States, I can't speak to here. I don't feel comfortable speaking to Canada, but I've done the research on it. What's the ethics that they learn? Business ethics. Whatever is good for profit margin and good for the board is good for the business. Now, that lacks such moral ambition and understanding that you are actually a part of society and you use society's resources. You sometimes don't get taxed for it, and you sometimes don't get recognized that you should be taxed for it. But let's call the reality what it is. You are part of the society. Even the Supreme Court in the United States has decided they have a vote. Then what are you giving back? And you have this greenwashing of giving back too, that if you scratch the surface of many businesses and what they say they give back and what actually happens are two different things. So there is something to bear here. From a complex systems analysis, if you're not teaching from a higher education standpoint, much higher morals and values, you could argue you've obfuscated your responsibility. And so that leads into it. That's an influence point. That is, from a complex system, a leverage point. And then it goes into all these other pieces that you're mentioning. What are the checkpoints? How do we check in? What's the oversight? And we currently have an environment where oversight is being reduced. Well, we know what will follow. We know that. And it's not that power corrupts all. I know that statement is said. It's much more nuanced than that. It doesn't mean it's going to corrupt everything, but it's a greater chance that it will. Deregulation of the financial systems. Gee, what happened? Are we so surprised?
Mm-hmm.
That we need oversight, because also we know people will evolve into lesser forms of values, or not even know what the big system is doing. That happened with some of the failures with some of the banking systems. You have underemployees asked to do things. They're not given the why. They don't even know why. Then they learn later on what they were doing was really against the law, and they didn't know. And so there are many choice points. We can make something different about this. Absolutely. What man and humankind starts, we absolutely can finish. We absolutely can finish it and change it.
100%. I'm glad I asked that, so thank you.
No, that's a great question, and you brought us back to a wonderful conversation we had prior.
Yeah, I think it needed to be discussed. Like I said, especially with someone in your field. All right, the next question. Is there a person that you'd recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
Absolutely. There's a couple I would think about. One of my close colleagues, two of my close colleagues, David Koppel. He was, when I came into the league in the NFL, he was probably the longest serving sports psychologist, but he's a clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist. So he's spent a lot of time serving police and actually firefighters and he's based in the Seattle area. And so when you're so cross-trained as he is, that you are going to be pulled into these other performance environments to maintain occupational health and performance readiness. And he served that community. He's semi-retired now, but semi-retired for his level means he's probably working 3/4 time. Another person I think of is a very close colleague as well. He's an underachiever, like my a good friend David Koppel, Dr. David Koppel, I should say, is Dr. Patrick Biley. So he is a forensic psychologist and worked long-term with the Calgary Police Department. He is a clinical psychologist. He is a sports psychologist, and he is a lawyer. And his job was in the Supreme Court of Canada. And so he has spent his whole life, probably the majority of his career, dedicated to working with police. He's worked a lot in sport at a very high level as well. But he's they're both incredibly thoughtful human beings dedicated their life to those who serve, but also just brilliant men. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, they both sound amazing. So if we're able to help facilitate a connection, I'd love to get them on.
Oh, happy to. I look at them as great mentors, as great supports to me throughout my career. So
brilliant. Well, the last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find you